when there's a child out there that's not getting the same that your own child is getting, the difference will tell, and there will come a time in the society where that child is going to take his pound of flesh.
Where you can actually, everything from watching a program with the child, you can start up the conversation from something on the TV and say, oh, you know.
For me, it's like, hurry up with this business. And the other one said, Auntie, it's not about me, it's about the guys. They're not ready to marry.
Yes. If she wants to ask something, no, I know my mother very well. In fact, the most interesting one is when I put up pictures on WhatsApp, you know, Snapchat filters and all that, she will call me, remove that picture. There was a day, I got tired of all that and I said,
Hello and welcome. It's time for another interesting package of
Everything Music.
Angelina, you dey cool in my temperature. If you call, I go come deliver.
This is Talking Movies.
In times of old, the world was full of wonder.
Stop it! Welcoming you to your weekend for today.
Arise, oh, come patrol. It's time to use our voice.
Beyond Six Packs.
Bills, 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 bills.
Pay the bills. Keep paying my telephone bills. Pay my bills.
Welcome to Gallery.
Me and my paddies.
London for what?
London for medicine.
Medicine for what?
Medicine for coffee.
Are you sickness?
To our illness. Welcome to Gist Zone.
All right, my name is the Eselucien Wego One. Ona nyokoko nyonyo.
This week on Executive Discuss.
So why am I here? I'm not here to make money. I'm not here to make money. I'm here to build people up for them to be themselves and create a better future. I will never lose hope in Nigeria, despite the challenges of nation building.
INEC declares Professor Chukwuma Soludo
as winner of Anambra governorship election.
Deepening relations between Nigeria and France tops agenda as President Buhari arrives in Paris on official visit.
It's a global forum for discussing global challenges, and so it is important for Mr. President to take part in that.
Those in favor that the Senate do approve the Conference Committee report on the Electoral Act number 6, 2010, say aye.
National Assembly finally puts to rest the 2010 Electoral Act Amendment Bill.
On Good Morning Nigeria today, we continue our conversation on securing democracy in Africa.
And the conversation on securing democracy in Africa continues today as we examine the trajectory of democratic process being thrown up and truncated on the continent.
Well, that's true, Claire. Now, the systems of governance that we have seen by way of disruptions is such that coups have become, again, commonplace on the African continent. Mali, Guinea, an attempt in Chad and Niger, and of course the crisis playing out in the Sudan are clear indications that democracy, which had been taking root over the past 2 decades, is now on the road back.
And of course, Kingsley, it's also worthy to share the ideals that have been pushed forward by political science experts who try to explain or define what democracy is or should be. And of course, we know pointing to the very fundamentals of it as being, a power to the people, as a process that ushers in a lot of good governance to the people. And of course, they also, point to the fact that the fundamentals of democracy is basically what you make of it.
Well, in a sense, that's what you make of it. Well, the point has been raised, and indeed those points were emphasized by our guest yesterday when we had the first part of this conversation as to why democracy is imperiled on the African continent. What are the attributes of democracy? The rule of law, separation of powers, and ultimately the dividends of governance. Are African countries getting all of this in due proportion, and more particularly, what is being thrown up in terms of the governance dividends? We have also seen that democracy on the African continent, again, as our guest pointed out yesterday, democracy tends also to perpetrate the power of the big man, that is to say, the entrenchment of strong men rather than strong institutions. And when the institutions are weakened, more particularly the three arms of government, the legislature and the judiciary, where they are conscribed by the executive branch, in this case usually the presidency, then it becomes a lot easier for tyrants who claim to have been elected to pull through all kinds of constitutional amendments by which they extend their tenures, and then of course crisis breaks out shortly after.
Kingsley, I think the window of democracy blew right after the Cold War, and a lot of African countries benefited from it. In fact, according to some statistics, but more than 2/3 of Africa in then became politically stable, had democratic system. Unfortunately, at the turn of the century, the reverse became the case. More than 2/3 of those countries that became democratic immediately after the Cold War, turned out to be partially politically stable. So that is what we're seeing, and the people are becoming disillusioned and disenchanted, of course, with mistrust for their leaders, and that's what is of great concern for us today.
No question about that, Claire. We're saying that it's democracy working in Africa, and what are the challenges for us to, on the African continent, ensure that democracy takes a firm footing and delivers on its promise of being the government of the people, by the people, and for the people. As my colleagues said, that's why we are returning to this subject matter. Again today, my name is Kingsley Osadolo, and I welcome you to this edition of Good Morning Nigeria, live on the network service of the Nigerian Television Authority.
And I'm Claire Adelabu Abdulrazak. We do also thank you for joining us as usual on the program. I think we have a second leg, as Kingsley would say. We'll be reviewing the wrap up on the Anambra governorship election. The deciding factor, of course, being the Tuesday, November 9 supplementary polls for Ihiala local government area. Results have been collated and, of course, delivered. And the announcements, of course, have also been made. So we will be looking at the perspectives to the process, seen to be characterized and challenged, well, maybe here and there, on logistics, technology, and most importantly, we want to also look at the conduct of the people and how it all went. So, Kingsley.
All right, so Dennis Adegunloye, give us the highlights of the morning news.
All right, good morning, Kingsley and Claire. Good morning, Nigeria. Here is the morning news. The Independent National Electoral Commission, INEC, has declared Professor Chukwuma Soludo of the All Progressives Grand Alliance, APGA, as the winner of the 2021 Anambra State governorship election. Professor Soludo polled a total of 112,229 votes to beat his closest contender, Valentine Ozigbo of the People's Democratic Party, PDP.
Of APGA, having satisfied the requirements of the law, is hereby declared the winner and is returned elected.
This election has settled a lot of issues, and what we want is peace. Let Anambra State be in peace.
It is not over yet, but it's not for me to decide. Our party, our campaign, and our candidate has to sit down and decide on these things.
Meanwhile, Anambra State Governor-elect Professor Chukwuma Soludo has promised to work hard to justify the confidence reposed in him by providing the dividends of democracy to the people of the state. He made the promise while addressing journalists shortly after INEC declared him the winner of the governorship election. He thanked all stakeholders for their support and resilience.
At this moment, we must remember, and will continue to remember, all those who died in the course of this movement, especially the 3 policemen who were killed by unknown gunmen during our town hall meeting with youth in my ward. May God continue to grant their souls eternal rest. The run-up to this election, and the election itself, tested the resilience and integrity of our federal institutions. Many times there were tensions, especially as one party boasted that it must, quote, take or, quote, conquer Anambra by all means. Our institutions proved again and again that this country can achieve eminent greatness when our institutions rise up to the occasion.
Away from the election in Anambra State, President Muhammadu Buhari is in Paris, the French capital, on special invitation by President Emmanuel Macron. The visit, aimed at deepening relations between Nigeria and France, will last 4 days.
This is a global forum for discussing global challenges, and so it is important for Mr. President to take part in that, because a lot of those challenges affect Nigeria directly, and Nigeria is also very much engaged in either finding solutions to those or strengthening our capacity in those areas.
The National Assembly has passed the 2010 Electoral Act Amendment Bill, which was committed to its conference committee following variations in the versions earlier passed. The passage this time followed the approval of the committee's reports by both chambers.
Those in favor that the Senate do approve the conference committee report on the Electoral Act number 6, 2010,
say aye. Those against say nay. The ayes have it.
The federal government, in collaboration with states, is considering an Operation Feed Yourself campaign to encourage the establishment of urban farms and small home gardens. This is coming under the auspices of the National Economic Council and the National Council on Nutrition, and it is part of other efforts to address malnutrition and related challenges in the country.
We have what state governments will be doing, what federal government will be doing, how we can leverage on the resources of our partners. But also now, the Operation Feed Yourself is government wants to encourage Nigerians to have farm gardens in their houses, in their homes.
President Muhammadu Buhari's address at the opening plenary of the COP26 Climate Change Summit in Glasgow harped on the need for rich nations of the world to back their talk with action, noting that greater efforts should be channeled towards assisting developing countries to meet their nationally determined contributions. Now, the Nigeria Center for Disease Control has announced 64 new cases of COVID-19 in 8 states and the Federal Capital Territory. In the latest figures, Kaduna tops the daily charts with 23 new infections, followed by the FCT recording 13, Plateau 8, Bauchi 6, Lagos 5, Rivers 4, Bayelsa and Jigawa states 2 each, while Kano State recorded a single case. Nigeria now has 212,829 confirmed cases of COVID-19, out of which 204,335 have been treated and discharged. 2,914 deaths are now on record. Well, that concludes the news for now. Do continue with us after this break with Kingsley and Claire on the program Good Morning Nigeria. Have a nice day.
Switch over project, which is commonly referred to as DSO, which entails television channels switching from analog to digital broadcasting. It's one of the biggest projects embarked upon by this administration. Branded as Free TV, offers its viewers about 60 digital channels, including sports, music, movies, and news. The federal government has licensed about 23 set-top box manufacturers. 7 of them have self-production, employing several thousands of people. We've made it now compulsory for all stations in Nigeria to only broadcast productions made in Nigeria for products which are produced in Nigeria.
Shola, come and help me. You need to learn.
But I'm more interested in drawing.
How are you going to be part of the business if you don't learn?
You just don't understand.
Morning. Anyone for some Lipton?
The rich taste of Lipton awakens body and mind.
Let me have a look at your drawings. Son, these designs are amazing.
Lipton Yellow Label Tea. Awaken to what really matters.
Finally, the hero of Nigeria's democracy has arrived. He shall usher us into a new phase of development, peace, and prosperity. He is the father of the new Nigeria, His Excellency President Muhammadu Buhari, GCFR. Welcome to another season of giving Nigerians hope yet again. We are sure of a great future for both ourselves and generations yet unborn. We look forward to your leading us as a nation into our manifest destiny. Though the challenges against us as a people are many, we know that your leadership shall set us on the right path to our greatness. A new dawn beckons on us all, and having you as our president is a precursor to this. Thank you for believing in Nigeria. This message is from the Nigerian Television Authority, NTA.
The Super Eagles of Nigeria will look to stay in pole position in Group C when they take on the Lone Stars of Liberia. Can the Lone Stars of Liberia cause major shockwaves in the African World Cup qualifiers? It's Liberia versus Nigeria on the 13th of November in the African FIFA World Cup qualifier, showing on the network service of the NTA and Wazobia TV from 4:30 p.m. with live radio broadcasts on Cool FM, Wazobia FM and Nigeria Info. You can also join us online at sporty.com and NPFL TV. The FIFA World Cup qualifiers are proudly brought to you by BetNiger and supported by MTN, Coca-Cola and Dettol, proud sponsors of the Super Eagles of Nigeria.
You're watching Good Morning Nigeria on the network service of the Nigerian Television Authority. It's time for us to take our business news, and here is our correspondent, Aleka Okmanachi Aruwa.
The Nigerian National Petroleum Company Limited, NNPC, said some Nigerians may be stealing yearly about 42.25 million barrels of oil, worth $3.6 billion, at the prevailing price of $85 per barrel. The Nigeria Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative also said the country lost 42.25 million barrels of crude oil to theft in 2019. NNPC Group Managing Director Mele Kyari linked highly placed Nigerians to the economic sabotage. Chief Executive Officer Gbenga Komolafe, during a courtesy call on the Chief of Defence Staff, General Lucky Irabo, in Lagos, says soliciting support of the armed forces to tackle the challenge was necessary, without which new investment in the sector might remain elusive. Meanwhile, oil prices rose for a third session on Tuesday as the passage of AU's infrastructure bill, Chinese exports and the global post-pandemic recovery lifted the outlook for fuel demand. Brent crude was up 8 cents at $83.51 a barrel after gaining 0.8% on Monday. US oil was up 10 cents at $82.03, also after a 0.8% gain the previous day. With business news, Alika Opanachi Arwa.
All right, many thanks, Alika Opanachi, for the business package. And in a moment, we'll be joining Bayate before the newspaper review.
Bayo Atoyebe, our newspaper reviewer, is right here with us in the studios. Bayo, good morning and welcome.
Thank you, Kinsley. Good morning. Good morning, Claire.
Good morning, Bayo.
Good morning, Nigeria. Thank you.
All right, Claire, you want to kick off? The lead stories are basically the same, arising from electoral issues.
Okay, let's start with The Nation. And The Nation has the lead story as Soludo is governor-elect. Soludo is governor-elect. That's on the front page of The Nation. And INEC declares Abuja candidate winner of Anambra poll. And just insert there, you see how the parties stand. As predicted, the four main parties, Abuja, PDP, APC, and YPP. And of course, the number of votes they polled during the, if the camera can just tilt a bit down, and you'll find that's it. That's it. So, INEC declares Abuja candidate winner of Anambra poll. Let's now take you a little just above that story. Proposed revenue sharing formula pits federal government against states is to your right-hand column. It's there. Direct primary governors, National Assembly clash. That should be to your left now. That story continues on page 4. And we move up the nameplate. Government proposes death penalty for illegal gold miners. Details of that on page 2. 7 policemen, Air Force Chief in Zamfara and Kaduna, and crude oil production drops to 1.5 to million barrels per day, and Buhari in France for Peace Forum. Kingsley, that's...
Okay, we'll take a look also at the leadership newspaper. We just start from immediately below the name flag right down to the foot of the window page. Federal government and states to combat hunger with Operation Feed Yourself. Federal government and states to combat hunger with Operation Feed Yourself. The lead story comes with a kicker, and that is Electoral Act Amendment Bill. APC, PDP kick as National Assembly approves direct primaries. Lawmakers okay electronic transmission of election results and use of technology. Details of that story on page 4. President Muhammadu Buhari in Paris for Peace Forum. That's on the left-hand side. That's the first column from the left side. Bandits abduct 14 Zaria local government workers. Local government areas get 3% increase in new revenue sharing formula. That's the proposal still. They haven't received it. Police to get new salary structure. After leadership report, NNPC reverts to Naira charges on port dues. And finally, Soludo wins Anambra governorship polls. And you can see this course there. Claire had earlier read out those scores. Bayo.
Thank you, Kingsley. Well, the story of Anambra election dominates the paper. A candidate of the All Progressive Grand Alliance has emerged the winner of the Anambra election. The returning officer, Professor Florence Obi, declared that Charles Chukwuma Soludo of Abuja, having satisfied the requirement of the law, is hereby declared winner and is returned elected. The Vice Chancellor of the University of Calabar says that he polled 112,239 votes and won in 19 of the 21 local government area, including the Hiala, the supplementary election yesterday. Valentine Uzigbo of PDP polled 53,807, while Andy Uba of the All Progressive Congress got 43,285. The Ivan Uba of the YPP polled 21,261. Anambra election caused a lot of anxieties, and it turned out to be largely peaceful. Police had polled over 37,000 personnel, civil defense over 20,000 personnel. The DSS was there massively, so also was the army. It was plagued by late arrival of materials, and INEC mobilized personnel and material. But there were glitches. Some were caused by transporters contracted by INEC who pulled out at the last minute out of fear. So also were some ad hoc staffs, and therefore INEC was left stranded. But they were able to manage the situation.
I wanted to ask, you know, in reviewing these Anambra elections, I think what the Ihiala supplementary elections did was probably to give a stamp of credibility on the process. A thumbs up for INEC, isn't it?
Well, you see, by the time they had declared the results for 20 local government and one was outstanding, the Hiala, you had a population of 148,000 voters that were on the registered vote at Hiala. And therefore, if you look at the margin between the lead candidates, it was far, far less than the 148,000. So to fulfill the requirements of the law, INEC had to do that. And when it came to Ihiala, the supplementary election, Abga led with 8,283 votes. The PDP had 2,485, while YPP had 344. APC had 343.
So one would expect that, I mean, with the clarity or transparency and with all the observations made by, you know, the election observation monitors and all that, one would expect that, I mean, this should have just been a straight, okay, congratulatory message, Mr. Governor-elect, congratulations, and you know.
Well, it isn't exactly that straightforward. Even the primaries were acrimonious.
Yes.
And I think there are still some cases pending arising from those pre-election issues. And the gale of litigation is unlikely to stop just now. If any party or any candidate feels that it has a genuine case, of course, it is within its right to pursue that. So let's see how that plays out. But there are key features of the Anambra election that are quite worrisome. Quite worrisome. Now, when you look at the total number of votes cast, I'm not quite sure what the number, it's less than 400,000.
Yes.
Indeed.
About just about 300 and something thousand, which is just about 15% of registered
votes.
Yes, of registered voters in Anambra. One local governments that would ensure that a winner emerges. And in this case, we are saying 15% voter turnout. It's dismal. No question. And then you then ask the question, because when we took on the topic on Monday, our regular analyst, Ezenwa Wago, was asking, because I posed the question to him because he was in Anambra for several weeks before the election, and immediately after the election, he returned. Go and check the figures that the political parties were returning during their primaries. Where were those voters now when it came to election time?
But Kester, you know, I think it was on Friday last week when we had this discussion. We said two things could impact on the turnout of voters in Anambra election. First, tradition. Historically, the Southeast, turns out very low. Has this history of voter apathy. That is one. And then you have the threats, and the sit-at-homes and all that. And unfortunately, as at the time we hear, when the sit-at-home was, recalled, when IPOB, asked people to go back, it didn't circulate. The information didn't circulate. So a lot of people didn't actually get to hear that, look, you can come out and cast your vote, so they stayed at home. You remember, this was one of the logistic issues that happened, I think, in Ihiala. By the time the transporters got to know that they could come out and time was gone.
Yeah. So that is true. But Claire, the point is, the low voter turnout is a feature in Anambra, not necessarily the entire Southeast. But the other point is, the figures I'm just getting now, our producer is just sending this to me now. Total number of registered voters in Anambra, 2.5 million. Accredited voters, 253,388. Valid votes, 241,523. Then invalid votes, you have 8,100. So this is about, you have about 250,000 voters who came out. The percentage is pretty low. Claire, the security situation you were talking about, the unknown gunmen who were on the rampage ahead of the elections and even during the primaries could have disrupted the primaries. But that's why I'm saying, let us go back and check the figures that the parties were posting during the primaries. So where were those party members when it now came to election time?
Anyway, Kingston, we have this as a part of our second leg topic for today. So then we'll have the political scientists look at the issues critically. What are the issues? What could have gone wrong by you? But let's also take a look at other stories.
But Claire, before we take another story, congratulations to the winner who's been declared. That's Soludo, governor-elect. Soludo will be the second 1984 graduate of the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, to be governor of Anambra State.
Oh my God.
Peter Obi, no, hang on a second. Peter Obi was governor of Anambra State. He was of the class of 84. He studied philosophy. Soludo studied economics, also class of 84, so he will be the second. He will also be the second former governor of the central bank to become the governor of a state once he's sworn in. Clement Isong was governor of central bank, and he later became governor of Old Cross River State.
What class are you?
That's out of the question.
Is of UNN.
No, it's not. It's not the issue.
It's apart from
No, that's not. My biographical details are off limits for this conversation.
Background information.
Honestly,
we can discuss that off.
I appreciate the details, Kingsley. But let's go on. Okay, let's quickly. Bayo, you just have less than 2 minutes. Okay, if the producer allows that. Well, so, Kingsley, do you have any other story you would like him to review?
Well, there's a story that we talked about. It is not here on the front page of the papers. That is the conviction of Mena, the former pension chief, who has been sentenced to 61 years, running concurrently, going to 8 years. The judge pointed out that two banks, UBA and Fidelity Bank, ought to have been charged along with Mena because they used those banks as the conduit for the over 2 billion naira fraud.
That is laundering.
Well, yeah. So, but that's to say, they were, the judge in his considered judgment said, considered judgment, that those banks served as conduits and wondered why they were not charged along with it. In my respectful view, that should not be the end of the matter because they said that they opened fictitious bank accounts. So what is the regulator of the industry now going to do to those two banks? What is the regulator? Did you follow the banking regulations? Security. And if you didn't follow and you served as a conduit for defrauding pensioners, who the judge, of course, came down heavily on those persons. So what will the CBN do to those two institutions?
NDIC, Financial Intelligence Unit, all of them will have something to do there.
We can only just wait, watch, and see what happens, Bayo. I'm afraid you won't be able to take more of your yellow pages.
Okay, thank you.
Yellow pages? Those are advertisements. But this is an interesting one. Operation Feed Yourself.
Yes.
I don't know how that's going to work out.
Yes, you are going to overshoot our time.
We are eating into the time already. But Operation Feed Yourself, how is that going to work out? It'll be a tough one, but I'm sure we'll have the opportunity of returning to the subject matter at some
other time, yes. Thank you.
Bayo, thanks a lot. Claire wanted me to disclose my biographical information on air. We'll do that outside. No. All right, it's Good Morning Nigeria, live on the network service of the Nigerian Television Authority. We'll take a short break now. When we return, we'll get ahead with our topics for discussion this morning.
Ministry of Works and Housing has the responsibility to help improve the quality and the quantity of the road infrastructure assets, which are the roads and the bridges and the highways. At the moment, we have over 13,000 kilometers of road network under repair, reconstruction, or rehabilitation out of the existing 35,000 kilometers of federal road network. These 13,000 kilometers are comprised in about 850 different contracts which the ministry superintends across Nigeria. We are fulfilling the mandate of our ministry to expand the connectivity of Nigeria's states and by extension the towns and villages through road transport.
How to make a perfect bowl of love? A perfect blend of taste that brings every ingredient to life. The fusion of different spices. The unique aroma that rejuvenates your senses. The heartwarming deliciousness. And the satisfaction that comes from every bite, which makes you say, I love my Indomie.
Dear compatriots, our country can be as great as we want.
Let us all commit ourselves to its greatness.
We must be willing to set aside our differences, unite and stay as one.
In our expansive landmass, human and material resources, and plurality lies our strength.
Let our challenges lead us to rediscover our common ground, and together, let's find solutions.
This will take some time, so it requires patience, tolerance, and forgiveness from every one of us.
Let all hands come on deck to protect and transform our country.
Let us unite and see each other not as adversaries, but as brothers and sisters.
Together, we can build a better Nigeria for ourselves and for the next generations.
This message is brought to you by the National Orientation Agency, NOA, with support from Nigerian Television Authority, NTA.
The Super Eagles of Nigeria will look to stay in pole position in Group C when they take on the Lone Stars of Liberia. Can the Lone Stars of Liberia cause major shockwaves in the African World Cup qualifiers? It's Liberia versus Nigeria on the 13th of November in the African FIFA World Cup Cup qualifier, showing on the network service of the NTA and Wazobia TV from 4:30 p.m. with live radio broadcasts on Cool FM, Wazobia FM and Nigeria Info. You can also join us online at sporty.com and NPFL TV. The FIFA World Cup qualifiers are proudly brought to you by Bet Niger and supported by MTN, Coca-Cola and Dettol, proud sponsors of the Super Eagles of Nigeria.
All right, this is Good Morning Nigeria live from our station here in Abuja, and you're watching, of course, our focus today is on securing democracy on the African continent. Now, here is a reminder of the ideas that some political experts pushed forward in our previous episode or in our previous edition of Good Morning Nigeria. It was compiled by Oyemi Ajayi.
Democracy, particularly in West Africa and in the rest of Africa, is a function of the context in which we have, as a continent, facing insecurity, poverty, growing population, youthful bulge, which has resulted in many young people finding their countries unsatisfactory in terms of the leadership. The other issue I wanted to talk about was the conflictual nature of politics and the very nature of its contestations, the internal contradictions that it creates, and the inability of the institutions that hold up democracies to be able to handle the weight that's coming from the contending factors.
Even here in Nigeria, the political parties, the politicians, the elite, everyone runs to Aso Rock for presidential protection. Now, we are doing exactly what is said to be wrong. But when we have a situation where we want democracy to work, and I want to observe here that, look, democracy can be secured regardless of the type of democracy we have in Nigeria. Because our democracy in Nigeria has multidimensional colorations.
They lack the political will, the courage to tell themselves the truth. Instead, they say it's a club of big men. They drink champagne and then tell them. But otherwise, even the AU has what they call peer review mechanism. It is supposed to go and say, my friend, what is this that you are doing? But they don't do that. Instead, when the military now strikes, then they say they are condemning the military. When in fact they are the ones, they have caused the political coup or constitutional coup.
You know,
All right, so those were excerpts from the first part of our conversation on securing democracy in Africa, and that took place yesterday. Today, we have three guests with us in the studios right here in Abuja, and so some of the glitches we experienced with our Zoom connection yesterday will not arise. Let's welcome Professor Ibrahim Jibrin. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Democracy and Development. Professor Jibrin, pleasure to have you on Good Morning Nigeria.
Thank you very much.
Also here with us in the studios is Professor Jide Ofor Adibe. He's a professor of international relations and political science at Nasarawa State University in Kefi, in nearby Nasarawa State. Professor Adibe, pleasure to have you with us on Good Morning Nigeria today.
Thank you, Kingsley.
Okay.
Okay, and we also have in our studio Mainasara Kogo Umoro. He's a lawyer and international affairs analyst. Thank you very much for joining us, sir.
It's always my honor to be here for nation building.
Okay.
All right. Maybe we'll begin with the same establishment question that we asked yesterday when we were having the first part of the conversation, so we get the views of today's guests on it, on the basis of what is happening on the African continent, Sudan, Chad, missed it by Whisker, Niger, the same thing, but Mali, Guinea. And there are threats all over the place, and some of the democratic countries, obviously, some would say, are standing on rickety stilts. So, Professor Ibrahim Jibrin, beginning with you, is democracy in retreat in Africa?
Well, there's no doubt that democracy is in retreat. Let's go back to between 1990 and 1994, when 38 African countries transited from either military or one-party rule to multi-party democracy. Following that, a normative structure was set up in the African system through the African Union to accept and generalize certain key values that will make democracy sustainable. The Harare Declaration in particular said no African president should have more than 2 tenures in office, because the consensus on the continent was that people stay too long in power, they lose sight of reality, they become dictators, and nobody is able to put a check on them. The moment African presidents started reneging on the Harare principle and sustaining themselves longer than 2 terms, then they lost legitimacy. And the military has always been on the waiting line that if these people misbehave, that opens doors. So that's the fruits we are reaping today. Increasingly, in more of our countries, the military feel coup that had been completely delegitimized has a right to come back because the civilians in power are misbehaving themselves. Therefore, we have an excuse. We all know military rule can never be better than a democratic form of rule. But they are just looking for excuses, and many of our presidents are giving them those excuses. So I agree with you. There is democratic regression in Africa, and we must come back to the fight we fought in the 1980s and 1990s to re-establish democratic principles.
All right, thank you, Prof. Let's also bring in the political scientist amongst us. That's Professor Jideofor Adibe. Prof, what's your own perspective? Do you share the same view with Professor Jibrin that the democratic process is retreating? If so, then is the problem foundational or conceptual?
Well, thank you very much. Let me start by saying that it is not only in Africa. Globally, or rather, let me set the context that what we call democracy or the democratic space can expand or contract. There are moments in history where the democratic space expands, and there are other times where it starts to contract. So globally, you can say that democracy has been on retreat globally. But if you come to Africa, yes, there are concerns. In the period between 1960 and 2019, we had an average of 4 coups per year in Africa. From 2001 to 2019, it decreased to about incidence of 2 per year. Now, we were just in the second year of the decade, and we have already, in fact, this year alone, we have had about 6 attempts. Between 2017 and now, of the 11 coups globally, apart from Myanmar, 10 took place in Africa. So if you focus only on those coups, you can say, yes, democracy is being threatened. But I will be very cautious in arriving at such conclusion, because what happens is that we are still called the democracy in transition. We still are transitional democracy. And one of the features of democracies in transition is that in the short to medium terms, the free speech guarantees in liberal democracies often aggravate structures of conflict, and people get disenchanted. And as Professor Jibrin said, this type of disenchantment becomes sort of invitation for military coups. Yes, there is a concern, especially about contagion effect, or what we can call Me Tooism. with all these things happening, can others start to think of it? But I think it's too early for us to conclude, because as I say, the democratic space tends to be elastic. It can contract, it can expand. There may be other forces that can be unleashed, to push it forward. But I agree with Professor Jibrin that what we need is to be vigilant, to make sure that there's not a complete reversal of the gains we've had in our democratic experiment.
All right, let's come to Menasara Kogo Umar. What's your take on the specter of democratic collapse in parts of Africa?
Well, I don't see it as a democratic recession. Democracy, nothing is wrong with democracy in Africa. I'm taking a contrary view because 25 years back, generally countries, especially Africa, imbibe democracy. If you take the events in the 70s, there were more problems of undemocratic takeover of leaderships in Africa in the 70s than we are witnessing currently. And globally speaking, for about 10 years back, we witnessed pockets of crisis, pockets of civil unrest, pockets of things. Most of them have nothing to do with military takeover, but rather civil uprisings, trying to topple government by means of revolution. You call it Arab Spring, you call it whatever, you call it whatever. So since then up to now, we have not gotten stability. And the main reason simply is that the world in the past 20 years decided unofficially to adopt democracy as the model of governance to entrench development in their respective countries. Now, in doing this, we decided to neglect some very, very fundamental things that are the basis upon which democratic or any form of governance stability will be predicated upon. We refuse to take into cognizance the culture, the tradition, the customs and the costumes of the people. We decided that democracy, if you look at, is an imported imperialist form of governance. We decided to bring into our settings without taking into peculiarities of the real demands, the real culture, the real history, the real tradition of our people. And these are some of the problems that are germinating. When you neglect to take into cognizance these type of basic things, if you are entrenching a political culture, then you are bound to meet these type of problems. Then it is the degree of the maturity with which you apply adjustments when this type of things happens that will make you. For example, the crisis in Mali, the crisis in Chad, the crisis in this West African country, and then what we are witnessing currently in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. All these are products of the failure of the continental political mechanism to really absorb and decimate these type of problems. In those days, especially in the 1975, with the advent of the Organization of African Unity, the Union was more proactive when it comes to matters of really saying no to any form of illegal incursion into democratic architecture of any country. And then after that, we even had periods whereby whenever there is any attempt against any stable political institution, we had standard military force that will be able to say no to this, that will be able to checkmate this. But currently, what we are having in Africa is we are having hypocrisy of democracy. For example, the chairman of the African Union is a product of military overthrow. For example, in the West African sub-region, we have abandoned ECOMOG that is supposed to come out and checkmate instability within the West African sub-region. And then you remember in the First Republic, for example, in 1960, when most of these countries were getting independence, for example, anywhere you are having instability, the leadership of the various countries, especially the strongest countries, Gamal Abdel Nasser, Emperor Haile Selassie, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, you take Malan Doda Jawara of Gambia, you take Nkwame Nkrumah of Ghana and Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe and Wakra Tafawa Balewa of Nigeria, these people will just symbiotically connect and then will say no to this particular thing. And then, but we don't have standing qualities, such type of pan-African statesmen nowadays. Politics is a game of evolution of quality leaders that will graduate ultimately as statesmen. But nowadays we have leaders concerned only within their own political enclave without really thinking about it. So long in Africa we decided to neglect any political system that would not be for the entrenchment of the interests, aspirations of our history, collective heritage, and the common demands of a common man. So long in Africa, we neglect to think of symbiotic family relationship. Our leaders should really reconnect and think about it. So long we now allow every country to be the determinant of its own political upheavals, political fate. So long we will continue to be having this type of problems. Democracy, like I said, is a foreign imperialist importation into Nigeria. But you want it to work, you must tally it creditably to our history, to our culture, to our current and future demands of the civility that democracy is all meant about.
Sarah,
Yes.
you've raised a number of issues, and I think that it is useful to clarify this for our viewers. I mean, your point of view that you have talked about, that democracy is antithetical, in your view, to our culture, our tradition, and history. I'm sure the other guests will have the opportunity of responding to it. But there are some historical claims you are making that in the 60s, this wasn't a phenomenon. In the 70s, it wasn't a phenomenon. Will the facts bear that out? I mean, a few of the African countries that gained independence were collapsing on the basis of coups. Olympio in Togo, Nigeria had its own experience, Ghana had experience. And then in the 70s that you're also talking about, you also saw the specter of coups, attempted, successful, a number of it bloody.
So what? It was more prevalent than now. That was what I was saying.
No, that's not what you said.
No, what I was saying was that we were experiencing military incursions in the 70s more than we are witnessing now. So it is on that basis I said democracy is now stronger than that time, that period. Then I now recollected back at around 1960s. That time there was this connectivism in our leaders. They see what is happening in their neighborhood, in their regional bloc, at the continental level, as what is happening in their bedroom. So they rise collectively and fight it. But nowadays we have thrown out that one. That is the reason why we are seeing reincarnation of the 1970s phenomenon.
Okay, Professor Jibril and Professor Adibe, I'm sure you would want to have your own perspectives to what Nasra said about democracy being antithetical to our culture. I think if democracy is representative, it has a lot to do with the African traditional way of administration. I mean, some African, states, and in the way we administered, governance in those days. But Professor Jibril, let's look at the concept of democracy. It's intangible. It's a concept that is driven by institutions. I mean, on its own, you have said there's nothing wrong with democracy. You have said democracy is retreating. Does it then imply that it is no longer a system of government that appeals to the people? Or by retreating, are you looking at the institutional, structures that drive the process?
Let's just reestablish what history taught us. Between the 1930s and 1960, all African countries spent over 3 decades fighting, battling for democracy. All our great nationalists devoted their life for democracy, which we got for most of our countries in 1960. By 1963, the regression started with the coup and the assassination of President Olympio in our neighboring country. And since then, we had these incidents through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Democracy is about a certain number of core values: freedom, liberty, the right of every member of the community to participate in public affairs and in determining how that society community is run. Talk to any Igbo philosopher and he will tell you 1,000 years before colonialism, they have practiced democracy. So Nasara is trying to provoke us. We refuse to be provoked because we know what democracy is. We know we've always loved it. We've fought it. We've fought for it. And it's an inherent part of our values. Nasara, we are not provoked.
All right, Professor Adibe.
Let me say the whole notion of democracy, I think it's better to make a distinction and talk about liberal democracy so that the freedoms are underlined. In liberal democracy, we talk about those basic things, values, as Prof. Jibril said, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and all those freedoms. And the danger in trying to make a distinction about what is African democracy is, in the First Republic, what it led us to was one-party state. In fact, the whole notion of African democracy was defined as talking till everyone agrees, or agreement by exhaustion. And after independence, most of the struggle for independence, I'm not sure if it was a struggle for democracy in the liberal form, as Professor Jibril said. It was more like fighting for freedom. You wanted to be independent, and freedom inheres one of those values you get in democracy. But shortly after independence, there was this gravitation towards one-party rule. The argument was that African democracy was different, that you wanted to domesticate democracy. And the argument was that in Africa, the Africanist notion of democracy did not allow for political parties, and that the concept was built around talking till everyone agrees. So what we all saw was that quickly led to a degeneration. So across all African, most of them became one-party states. So when we want to talk about, Patricia asked about conceptual notion of this democracy, it's important to know that you can still be democratic even when you're not having political parties. That's why in the communist German society, Eastern Germany, you still call them German Democratic Republic. In Korea, North Korea, that we call autocratic, they still believe they are democratic. Professor Jibril was a Marxist. I don't know if he's still one, but we know that the notion of democracy, they talked about, it is important to talk about bourgeois democracy, which they call liberal democracy. And they believe their own real one is the real, because it's the democracy that sought to provide the economic means, access to economic means to everyone. And they believe they were the real democracy. So we can have contestations over the conceptual notion of democracy. But I believe what we are trying to think about here is liberal democracy. And these often are characterized that periodic election is central to that. Allowing multi-party states, parties to flourish, is central to, it's one of those values, one of those features. So if we want to move away from the liberal notion of democracy to start talking about democracy as a concept, then we can get into several variants. And people like Professor Jibril and others will like to tell you that even in you can go back to old Athens, the Greek city-states, where people meet in village squares. In Igbo society, every adult took part in decision-making. That was pristine democracy. That was democracy of a variant, not the type of liberal democracy I believe we are looking at today.
So is Africa trying to move out of that liberal democracy? Is that what is happening on the continent?
No, what I said is that the democratic space in every country tends to be elastic. Can you see, if you see it at a point Spain, at a point Portugal, certain times there will be like threats to democracy. And in the Western world, they're able to bounce back. You can see what happened under Trump. That was a threat. In fact, across, if you go to France, they were attempts actually in some countries, there have been attempts to reverse some of the democratic gains. And suddenly it will bounce back and expand the democratic space to the point that now freedom will be even given to men to marry. So what I'm saying is that it is too early for us to conclude. But in terms of liberal democracy, we have to be on the guard, because in this year alone, we have had 6 coups in Africa. That moves away from the average from 2001 to 2019. The average was 2. In the era from 60 to 2000, the average was 4. So statistically, you can see there is cause for concern in terms of them. But we should just be vigilant. It is still too early for us to conclude that there is democratic reversal.
No, well, I don't know if we're going to await many more instances of the overthrow of constitutional governments before we apprehend the fact that, look, democracy is on the retreat on the African continent. I want to come back to Professor Jibrin. Perhaps, we situate this much more properly, because the context in which we are discussing, we all recall in the 60s and in the 70s, there was intellectual support for the takeover of elected governments by military authorities. There were intellectuals who supported that. But there came a realization, and post the 1990, we then saw the growth of constitutional democracy on the African continent, beginning, of course, with the constitutional conferences in the French-speaking African countries. And then people then said, no, you must give power back to the people, periodic elections, and the other key ingredients of democracy: rule of law, separation of powers, and the democratic principles enunciated in the Harare Declaration, even though, unfortunately, Robert Mugabe turned out to be one of those who turned that declaration on its head. The question, therefore, to ask is what we are seeing now in recent times on the African continent. What are the factors that are driving it such that constitutional democracy is unraveling?
I think it's a situation in which self-interest overtakes the common interests. The African Union was founded on turning the back at the Organization of African Unity, which accepted as a reality that there will be coups, that countries can do whatever they want in their internal affairs, that it's a club, essentially, of dictators. And what the foundational principles of the African Union did was to say, no, we have a lot of learning from the years of dictatorship and single-party rule. The first learning was, when I was a student in the 1970s, the #1 American political scientist was Huntington, who made this strong argument that the military is a modernizing force. They are modern, they are democratic, they are organized, they can lead Africa to development. And that gave the intellectual justification for coups that were coming up. After 40 years of military rule, we discovered that it's not true that they were well organized. It's not true that they were a positive force for development. Thirdly, that they were even more corrupt than the civilians we were talking about. So that delegitimated American political science in Africa, and Africans themselves decided to enact core normative values that will determine the way forward. And that's the moment at which, first of all, we said, since we have core values, we must not allow any country in Africa to do what it wants. Remember 2005, when Yadema died and his son took over. President Obasanjo at that time and the president of Niger, who was then the chairman of the OAU, went there and told him, young man, step down. We have core values. The whole principle of the ECOWAS protocol on democracy and good governance was that, unlike in the past, we must watch over ourselves, and when sitting heads of states misbehave, we must set them on the right path. The tragedy today is that we are weakening on that front. So, a coup occurs in Chad. The president of the African Union happened to have been appointed by the Chadian president. He's a Chadian. So he suddenly refuses to apply the principles we had collectively agreed on, and that gave encouragement to others. There are, of course, attempts to go back to the principles. We've just had the ECOWAS meeting, and one of the issues they said is that, well, for Mali and for Guinea, we cannot change those principles. We must go back to them. I agree with Professor Adibe that democracy is a constant struggle. It restricts, it expands, but what's important is that the majority of the African people are profoundly democratic and are always ready to struggle for democracy. Many of our leaders do not believe in democracy, and this is because one of the tragedies in African politics is that people of principle have been squeezed out of the political process. And you've had a series of racketeers taking over power in so many of our countries because these are reckless people ready to do anything and ready to use means that are not considered democratic. And this real struggle in Africa, therefore, is for us to rediscover leaders in our communities, in our societies, in our states and countries that are genuinely committed to these democratic principles that Africans believe in, so that they can lead in that struggle for the expansion of democratic space.
Okay, I don't know. I just wanted to ask, I don't know, maybe Professor Jibrin again or May Naisara, from all that is happening now, Professor Dibe says we need to be, cautious about the number of constitutional coups as well as military coups that's going on.
There's no constitutional coup. There's no constitutional coup.
Constitutional, yes. Constitutional, I mean, when, yes.
Breakdown of constitutional.
Breakdown of constitutional government.
We're going to say constitutional coup, like legitimizing.
But no, but it is a
constitutional coup.
Yes. When you elongate your term,
all right, no, in that sense, yes.
So what is happening? Is it an indication that, we were too hasty to adopt the liberal form of democracy? Or should we also amplify the prognosis of Chinua Achebe, about what he felt was the issue with Nigeria, and amplify it to our African brothers' failure of leadership, which you have earlier, hinted at?
You see, let me use an example. In 2005, President Tanja of Niger with President Obasanjo of Nigeria went to Togo and say, this is what the Constitution says. We don't want a constitutional coup in Togo. Step down, let the Senate President take over. 5 years later, 2010, Tanja's tenure ends, and there were supposed to be elections. It happened to be that in 2009, they discovered petroleum. Suddenly, he says, let's change this principle because we don't want somebody irresponsible to come and waste this petroleum wealth. So it's simply self-interest that now suddenly Niger is coming into money, and therefore he wanted to, so he gave himself a 3-year extension unilaterally. And that is not a constitutional coup. That is a coup against the Constitution. I'll put it the other way around. And I think the struggle in Africa for democracy must be focused around this issue of how do you stop regimes and people in power consistently and constantly carrying out coups against the Constitution, which is something we have agreed is the basis on which we'll operate our democratic systems.
You know, I'm wondering, gentlemen, this perspective is one that some analysts would argue is at the core of the issue. When you have a constitution, obviously the constitution is not produced by the executive. You have the parliament, in some cases it will be subjected, a draft will be subjected to a referendum. And then you also now have the judiciary. But what we have seen, where trouble erupts on the African continent, you find the almost total emasculation of both the legislature and the judiciary by the executive branch, which is why some persons continue to argue that what we have in Africa, strong men and weak institutions, we can throw in the element of the electoral management bodies that organize what some will refer to as sham elections as dictated by the executive branch. Why has this persisted, and why does it keep throwing up trouble that sometimes leads to the revolution you talked about, if not the invitation of the military?
Well, fundamentally speaking, it's the conspiracy of the elites. I remember when Nigeria's first democratic experiment was overthrown in 1966. What came about was that there was decree number 1. The decree number 1 that came about says that military overthrow, if it succeeds, is called revolution and is legitimized, is accepted in the African custom. But if it fails, the penalty is death, because it's called, it's treasonable. So, and then our courts now continued accepting that doctrine. Apart from our courts, our judicature now continue applying it. To such an extent now, all those voodoo legislations, the laws, the decrees, the military established. We now decided now to bring about a doctrine that anything done by the military, when it comes to democratic term, just change the word from decree to act. You have accepted it. And then we are swimming in it. So you can't eat your cake and have it. If we want to have democracy, we should avoid all undemocratic antics. We should be prepared to come out and say, yes, we want democracy. A common man's interests and aspirations should be the jewel of democratic inestimable value, rather than thinking of common man as a tool, as a spanner, to use him periodically every 4 years. At the end of it, throw it away, cut all the resources there, and then export it to those countries that exported democracy to us for safekeeping of the economic destiny, leaving the African continent continuously pauperized. Now, the citizenry haven't seen the squalor living, the pauperization, the difficulties, and the consistency of lies by the political class that remains mirage. They decide in one way or the other to go by the side of whether it's military or whether it's civil unrest or whatever is it, to support them, thinking that there will be El Dorado change at the end of it. And these are the problems we are having. By the time they now stage, you will see how tumultuous the citizenry will come out, because before the military took over, the hardship they are suffering, the negation of democratic tenets they are witnessing in the country was so enormous that an ordinary citizen will think that, yes, a phenomenon has come for my standard of living to be uplifted. So long African countries do not agree collectively to completely eradicate military or any undemocratic, not only military, even if you come by means of so-called revolution or whatever. So we have to agree collectively, donate part of your sovereignty to an institution that will be able to immediately be deployed as a rapid response mechanism institution to really restore democracy wherever there is any attempt on that. And then African countries, especially the leaders, should think as much as possible inside the box of Africa. Most of them are surrogates of the external powers. Most of them, most of the military overthrow you get, whether it's military or even civil overthrow you get, most of them are externally engineered. owing to so many factors, owing to indebtedness to the superpowers, owing to approach string of say whatever is it, you have to subject it to the acceptance or what have you. Even if there is any overthrow, you will see that the lukewarm attitudes of our leaders to come and condemn it. They will be waiting to hear what will be the response of the so-called superpowers, first of all, before they now decide to go and make their own positions known. Even if there would be position known, it will remain only a lip service position without concrete mechanism to really restore and backroll democracy on its own distance. We are witnessing these things, and whatever we have is a mere symbolic condemnation by the African leaders, and then they will say we are excluding you from participating in what we are doing at the level of ECOWAS, at the level of African Union. That is not enough. There must be institutional entrenchment of mechanism to checkmate it.
Thank you. I think I would like Professor Adibe to also come in here. We are seeking to examine the causative factors in the behavior of some African leaders who have been elected, who then turn around to twist the very elements of democracy, rule of law, separation of powers, recognized as a kernel of democracy, so that you don't have all the powers residing in a monarch. So what makes it possible in a number of jurisdictions in Africa for the leader to emasculate the legislature and then the judiciary, so that the legislature passes the constitutional amendments and then the stamp of authority is provided by the judiciary, and it says yes, as in Tanja, 3 years extension. In the case of Mugabe, he went on and on and on until, you know, his people, then his boys then said, look, this can't continue.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kingsley. Let me address one thing that I think we've overlooked. We've given this impression, I'm not sure if it's very correct, that the current wave of democracy is solely because of our struggle. It's not quite correct. What happened was that at the end of the Cold War in 1989 or 1991, depending on how you want to date it, there is a new, in fact, George Bush then proclaimed a new world order. And scholars like Francis Fukuyama called it the end of history. End of history meaning ideological contestations as we know it has come to an end. That was the beginning, because then America became the dominant, the hegemonic power. That was the beginning of the globalization of democracy, this current wave, liberal democracy. And in Africa, it started from Benin Republic in 1994. So that contagion effect then, you know, spread across. Yes, there were internal struggles, but the impulse came from abroad. Now, about what you're saying about, you know, the leaders, let us be also mindful of the fact that when you are called a transitional society, we are all emerging from a long period of authoritarianism, which means that in both our political behavior are embedded authoritarian impulses. So you can see the drive towards changing your constitution to third term as part of those authoritarian impulses driving or deriving from our authoritarian past. So the sort of democracy we have now will still always have elements of authoritarianism. So that even being able to negotiate and take advantage of some of the gains of the things we could do with the democracy, we are still not there. And it is not actually true that democracy promises you economic prosperity. There is no study anywhere I'm aware of that has made a conclusive finding that if you are operating liberal democracy, what we call dividends of democracy will automatically result. They say in the long run, people will be free enough to embark free enterprise, and then you can prosper. So what I think also happened is that there are many disenchantment with the system. And in many places, people are yearning for regime change. Because, as you say, with these authoritarian impulses and the fact that we are very new, relatively new, means they are not even managing the system. Elections are rigged. So quite often you have governments
that have the power without legitimacy. And people want regime change. And this often is an invitation to the military. Now, what happens? In the olden days, that is before 2001, it was an invitation for coup. Now, even the United Nations recognizes that sometimes people are powerless to change the government. We saw it in Côte d'Ivoire. You can refuse to go. And that is why the United Nations came up with the principle of what they call responsibility to protect. There will come a time where the UN will be forced by humanitarian considerations to intervene. So instead of people now clamoring for regime change, they can say, we wait for another 4 years to change you. And we know you can vote and nothing will happen. The same people you don't want. That's one thing why the recent coup in Sudan is different. In many other countries, when the coup happens, people flood to the streets and start welcoming the new military people. It's now in Sudan that they are protesting that they don't want it. And for me, that is a good lesson. And don't forget that in Sudan, Sudan has the highest incidence of coups in Africa. They have had 17 coups, with 7 succeeding. So I think we should also be very careful what I'm saying, that look at the external environment. You cannot divorce what is happening here from, one, the external source of our current democratic wave. Second, the fact that we are just emerging from a prolonged period of authoritarian rule. One of the features of this emerging authoritarian rule is there are so many bottled up feelings from our authoritarian past. And the free speech guarantee in liberal democracy enables us to unleash them on the democratic space. So it becomes chaotic in the short to medium term, and people are disenchanted. But the promise is that, look, if you persevere, if you remain on course, you will also be able to take advantage of that marketplace of ideas to resolve your problems.
You know, earlier on, Nasra talked about surrendering sovereignty, which I believe in a democracy, sovereignty of the people is already surrendered, via elections, to a representative. But the pull and push of, the democratic process, the expansion or the what you call elasticity of democracy, according to Professor Jidaofor Adibe, is the fact that the sovereignty that the people have entrusted in their leaders, is I mean, this sovereignty is what's the right word now? The leaders fail the people and fail to translate the sovereignty into the choices and desires that for which the people have done. So why is it that the people allow this leader, to trample on their on the sovereignty, on the powers? Is it that they are not politically knowledgeable, they're not politically aware, Professor Jidaofor?
Well, I'm not that's what I'm saying. If you trample on them, sometimes they know, but they are powerless. And that is why the United...
No, but they can't be powerless, because they know that the sovereignty that the rulers or the representatives bear...
Now, if you look at what happened, for example, when, say, in the Gambia, when the guy knew he was losing and refused to go, what are they going to do? So that is why the United Nations recognizes that there are times when people are powerless, when you have regime tyranny. So the United Nations, under what they call responsibility to protect, can then move in on the grounds that what affects one affects all, and be able to do something. That's why they put pressure on Jammeh to leave. And we also saw it in, was it in Guinea? We saw it in in Côte d'Ivoire, where contentious election, somebody who was losing said, I'm not going to go anywhere. So in that sense, you are right about the transference of sovereignty, but we see such very much exemplified in supranational institutions like ECOWAS, the United Nations. You can see the ECOWAS then moving the African Union through its Constitutive Act of 2000 would then move in and say, look, you have to do something. So we recognize that citizens, the democracy, we are maybe too much in a hurry. I'm not saying we should become complacent. Part of the thing we are doing now is to keep the government on its toes, but we are too much, maybe we can't be too dismissive or give up. We've only been in this phase now for less than, 25 years. And you can imagine that even a US that has been there since 1774, 1775, under Trump, everybody agreed there was a democratic reversal. The attack on Capitol Hill was more like a civilian equivalent of an attempted coup. So it was a reversal. We should remain on course. The civil society in Nigeria is so vibrant. And people are now standing up this for as long as they don't muzzle our ability to express ourselves, then we have nothing to fear. That is why in American Constitution, the Second Amendment about free speech is highly guarded because of First Amendment, because of the distrust of government. For as long as they allow us to say the truth and not try to use other means to silence free speech, then people will continue to hold the government, and over time, I believe the quality of governance will improve.
I just wonder, Claire, just the point that Professor Adibe and Menasara raised earlier, I would like Professor Jibrin to respond to it. Professor Adibe says that part of what we see in the emasculation of democratic institutions, the legislature and the judiciary, that then leads to tenure elongation, misgovernance, instances of authoritarian impulses. Menasara was saying, in a sense, that democracy is antithetical to our culture, to our traditions, and so on and so forth. You've already responded to that. But there's also the lingering view that even under the current constitutional democracy, in many parts of Africa, there is what we may loosely refer to as the Kabiyesi syndrome. In other words, we purport to democratically elect a leader, and then dress him up in the toga of a monarch, an absolute monarch, which is why the monarch will give instruction to the electoral management body, it will give instruction to the legislature, and will give instruction to the judiciary. And some persons argue that this is probably where part of our challenge is emerging from, because we have strong men and weak institutions.
And therefore alienate the people.
Big time.
Well, first I want to commend Menasara Kuku. He started by saying democracy is a foreign system, but is now making strong arguments that African countries should set up mechanisms to restore democracy whenever it is threatened. So I really commend you for this huge development in your thoughts. The question of authoritarian impulses is not so much the question of impulses, but the way in which, as you said at the end of your intervention, our institutions are weak. Legislatures were not in existence in Africa for between 30 to 40 years, depending on which country you are talking about. And under years of military rule, the judiciary started finding itself in a situation where it accepts instructions from the executive, or the individual members of the judiciary get punished. We know that Chief Justice in Africa has been assassinated because he refused to implement a directive from the president. And people have this issue of self-preservation. Everything is, at the end of the day, in the political system. If you want the rule of law, and if you want the separation of powers, which is to say the different powers are able to checkmate each other and thereby protect the democratic system in its entirety, then you have to make sure the quality of your electoral process is very high, and that people do not emerge as governors, as presidents, as legislators, because they have bribed their way through, because they've used thugs to beat up people and drive away voters or to steal ballot boxes. Because when you have people of principle, character, and commitment that emerge from your electoral systems, then they are able to stand their grounds and fight for what is right. For me, when I look at the politics of this country, for example, we've been able to sustain democracy for 21 years, but where we've been weak is the quality of the leadership that has been emerging through this democratic system. Are these people the most respected in their communities? Don't the voters know that a lot of these people are crooks who have very dubious histories that carry them to the wealth that they have? I think if we start correcting that political process itself, we then start improving the quality of the leadership that emerges. And that new leadership will be more capable and above all more committed to strengthening the institutions they have emerged to lead.
Okay, I think we just have one more minute just before we take a break, and then Professor Adibe, just briefly, we've talked about the quality of leadership and strong men. Could there also be external influencers?
Yeah, let me just quickly say that when you talk about institutions, or strong men and institutions, it is not structures only. Routinization of rules, observance is called institution. So that brings me back to the point I made that we need to be a little more patient, and that if you go back to, say, British history, during the period of Cromwell, for example, you can see political offices were being sold and bought. So what we are experiencing now, as bad as it is, you have to see it in the context of evolution. We are just emerging. Yes, I agree that there will always that threat that there will be a complete democratic reversal. That threat will always be there. But the fact that these things are happening does not necessarily mean that it's not working. If you see it as an evolution, it's a transition, then we will know that we are making progress. If you even look at Nigerian political system, in the beginning, 1999, people were snatching ballot boxes. Now they still rig. I think they've moved it to the collation center and the others. That itself means there's been a move, a shift. The issue of snatching ballot box is becoming anachronistic. So in that sense, we can come to a stage now where all those things, maybe if we endure and persevere in the next 15 years, the quality of our democracy will change. But for me, again, that is very much tied to the quality, the progress we have made in the nation building process.
Well, Professor Adibe and gentlemen, thank you very much. We're going on a short break now, but I think that there is also an underlying issue. Professor Adibe raised it, that there are no studies anywhere validating the claim that democracy yields economic prosperity. But some persons have also raised the view that democracy is not delivering on good governance. And an element of good governance is prosperity. We'll take a short break now. When we return, we'll continue with the conversation.
The housing solution we have developed is a multifaceted one. First, we have tried to lead a program to build what we think will be an acceptable and hopefully affordable housing type based on surveys we did in 2015-2016 and construction that started in 2017. And that's going on in 24 states as the National Housing Program.
This message is from the Federal Ministry of Information and Culture.
Finally, the hero of Nigeria's democracy has arrived. He shall usher us into a new phase of development, peace, and prosperity. He is the father of the new Nigeria, His Excellency President Muhammadu Buhari, GCFR. Welcome to another season of giving Nigerians hope yet again. We are sure of a great future for both ourselves and generations yet unborn. We look forward to your leading us as a nation into our manifest destiny. Though the challenges against us as a people are many, we know that your leadership shall set us on the right path to our greatness. A new dawn beckons on us all, and having you as our president is a precursor to this. Thank you for believing in Nigeria. This message is from the Nigerian Television Authority, NTA.
Let us all commit ourselves to its greatness.
We must be willing to set aside our differences, unite and stay as one.
In our expansive landmass, human and material resources, and plurality lies our strength.
Let our challenges lead us to rediscover our common ground, and together, let's find solutions.
This will take some time, so it requires patience, tolerance, and forgiveness from every one of us.
Let all hands come on deck to protect and transform our country.
Let us unite and see each other not as adversaries, but as brothers and sisters.
Together, we can build a better Nigeria for ourselves and for the next generations.
This message is brought to you by the National Orientation Agency, NOA, with support from Nigerian Television Authority, NTA.
Shola, come and help me. You need to learn.
But I'm more interested in drawing.
How are you going to be part of the business if you don't learn?
You just don't understand.
Morning. Anyone for some Lipton?
The rich taste of Lipton awakens body and mind.
Let me have a look at your drawings. Son, these designs are amazing.
Lipton Yellow Label Tea. Awaken to what really matters.
The Super Eagles of Nigeria will look to stay in pole position in Group C when they take on the Lone Stars of Liberia. Can the Lone Stars of Liberia cause major shockwaves in the African World Cup qualifiers? It's Liberia versus Nigeria on the 13th of November in the African FIFA World Cup qualifier, showing on the network service of the NTA and Wazobia TV from 4:30 p.m. with live radio broadcasts on Cool FM, Wazobia FM and Nigeria Info. You can also join us online at sporty.com and NPFL TV. The FIFA World Cup qualifiers are proudly brought to you by Bet Niger and supported by MTN, Coca-Cola and Dettol, proud sponsors of the Super Eagles of Nigeria.
All right, welcome back. It's a Good Morning Nigeria live on the network service. Just to remind you, in just less than 10-15 minutes, we'll be taking a quick look at what happened in Anambra. That's the concluding part of the governorship election. Kingsley, you had a question for...
The comment I made framed also as a question with regard to the nexus, between democracy and prosperity, and that one of the causative factors of disenchantment in a number of African countries, if you take a look at it, usually at bottom, is the fact that leaders are not delivering on good governance, and that an inherent element of good governance is prosperity. Professor Adibe.
Okay, first of all, there are two limbs to that. First, democracy never promises anybody that you elect, you get the best. It's like a beauty contest. Only those who show up, you select the best, the most beautiful from those who are up. As Erufai would say, the most beautiful will probably be in the husband's place. But those who show up, actually elections everywhere in the world is largely driven by emotion, not by facts. If you take that and add it to the fact that what you called good governance is also subjective and relative. The worst performing governor or leader, if you go and ask some people, has this man performed? If you take the current government, for example, and you say, has President Buhari performed? It depends on who you are asking. If you ask somebody who is AP supporter and somebody who buys into his agenda, they will mention the infrastructure, they will mention a few things. If you ask another person who doesn't buy, who doesn't agree with his own style of governance, the person can mention the high indebtedness, the insecurity in the land. So if we have to believe, get to the point that this thing is highly subjective and often relative, then on the question of whether democracy leads to prosperity by inference, I think what I said is that the argument, or what so many of the studies have said, in the short to medium term, it may even worsen economic development. And they will give the example of the Asian tigers to show that the time they were registering big economic progress, China, for example, they were not, they were not liberal democracy. Of course, critics say if benevolent dictatorship will be synonymous to, or even dictatorship will be synonymous to economic development, then Africa will have done great because we had our own fair share. The point, therefore, we have to establish is that it is not necessarily the system. In the long run, yes, if we persevere, it can help us to solve problems of, say, nation building, because we can have the opportunity to sit down in a table and discuss and agree. That's one thing they promise.
Okay, gentlemen, just in conclusion, how can we then stabilize or expand the democratic elasticity? I like to use that word that Professor Adibe used. How can we expand that elasticity at the moment? I know within the West African sub-region, ECOWAS has done quite impressive work. I don't know if that is also retreating. I know the US also have some programs, for grooming young African leaders. Professor Jibril.
Well, definitely in ECOWAS, the supplementary protocol on democracy and good governance has been an important tool in sustaining democratic regimes and expanding the democratic space. And when you look at the history of West Africa, this regional organization has played a very positive role, from the stabilization in Liberia and Sierra Leone through to the prevention of third tenures in many of our countries. Unfortunately, of course, over the past 2 years, all that has started crumbling, but the hope is that we'll still be able to go back to the issue. Let me just make a point about whether democracy and development...
In less than 60 seconds.
Yeah. Okay. There are two issues. Democracy doesn't always guarantee development, but what democracy does is that when government fails to bring development, then that government is sanctioned. And therefore, the projection of democracy is the perpetual search for governments that could deliver development.
Okay.
All right, Prof, thank you very much. One point, very quickly. The seat-tight syndrome in Africa, it's also been partly responsible for what we find, the disenchantment, and then the latest example being Guinea. We have seen Alassane Ouattara done third term, others have tried to do third term. Is it that African leaders are scared of life after office? And assuming they are scared of life after office, how might they be more usefully engaged after office?
Well, first of all, we should, panel beat our democratic structures to be people-oriented first. The reason why you see countries in Eastern Europe prospering more than the democratic countries, especially in Africa and the Western world, is simply because it is people-driven political system. While in our own context, it is an elitist-driven political system. An elitist-driven political system that is deliberately cajoled in such a way that it's contractual in nature. Investment is the issue, to derive benefits at the end of it. And then there is this fear that ultimately when I retire from office, what will be the consequence? They have seen cases of so many of them that are, recipients of warrants of arrest by the International Criminal Courts for one misdeed or the other. They have seen how so many of them at the end of office, they find it difficult to even live in the country. And this is the reason why they will do whatever they can to perpetuate themselves in power as a way to make the ends meet, so that they will be able to. So many of them will prefer to even die on seat than even to find themselves out of power.
So we just have to stop you. I'm afraid, yes, because we've really overspent our time for this conversation. We have other issue that we would like to quickly take a look at, which is the Anambra governorship election. The supplementary election which was concluded yesterday. Kingsley.
Well, not just the supplementary election, but the Anambra election in general. So we'll just take some comments from our three guests. Beginning with Professor Jibrin, what is your take on the eventual conduct and outcome of the Anambra election? Triumph of democracy or what?
I'll use Nigerian English. We thank God. We were so afraid. We were thinking there will be mass violence, the elections may not take place, that may threaten the future of Nigerian democracy. So today I say we thank God that in spite of all our fears, the elections took place, a winner has emerged. But I think the point I want to make, Professor Adibe and myself were at the CDD Election Analysis Center. And the major issue is that we shouldn't underestimate the capacity of Nigerian society to intervene to preserve democracy. In Anambra, elders stood up and said, we must not allow our state to collapse.
Okay, yes, let's look at the transparency. Yes, and credibility of the process.
Yes, the Anambra election is a theater for the rehearsal of 2023 elections. First of all, it's a theater for us to see further robust entrenchment of electronic device in conduct of elections. That is relevant to what the National Assembly is currently debating about, the amendments of the Electoral Act. That is one. Secondly, we have seen situation whereby Nigerians are ever determined to entrench robust democracy as a system of governance, because the participation, the peaceful conduct, if you look at it relatively, there were no casualties. And then thirdly, I must commend INEC. Despite all the intimidations, all the type of attacks their offices witnessed in that region, they successfully conducted the elections reasonably, we would say, to our satisfaction. Then fourthly, we have seen statesmanship, disposition of statesmanship by the contestants. They pledged that they will play by the rules, and at the end of it, we have seen friendliness in the way they do, with the exception of few political parties that refuse to sign the electoral verdict. We pray at the end of it, there will be less post-election acrimonies.
That is democratic. Professor Adibe, let's look at the turnout. Kingsley and I spoke about it earlier on. What are your views about the turnout?
Well, the turnout, I don't have the full figures, but I just want to refer you to the fact that in 2010, the turnout was 16.3%, yet increased to 21.7% in 2013. There is nothing in our laws that says a certain turnout threshold must be reached. In one of the interventions, my friend and brother, Professor Jibri, gave himself 20% threshold, but that's neither here, and he failed anyway. So even if it is 10%, what is important with the turnouts is, if the margin of victory is very decisive, then the chances of contesting the outcome becomes very little. So with the decisiveness of the victory of APGA, I think, of course, I don't expect much litigation. Anambra has always, let me also underline that historically, Anambra state elections are not characterized by violence. This has been different because of all these, what happened with agitations and all these things. So this may be also in keeping with this tradition that Violence never mars this election. What often happens, it is a highly litigious state where people who have deep pockets will go to at any length using the court processes. We have to see whether the decisiveness of the outcome, the decisive victory will deter such litigious something. Another point that is important is if the election did not hold, one of the implications will be that the state, the Nigerian state, has considered Anambra State as a non-governed space to non-state actors. So to the extent that the government tried, and with the collaboration of others, and the election took place, that also is a way for the state to re-emphasize the fact that it has the legitimate power. It's still in control. Remember, under the Montevideo Convention on what constitutes a state, one of them is that you must be able to have effective rule. That's one of the things that they have demonstrated in Anambra election.
It's effective occupation.
All
right. Thank you very much, Professor Adibe. Just to indicate the figures that we have, the turnout is around about 10%. You have about 2.5 million registered voters, turnout around 253,000. So that's about 10% voter turnout. Interestingly, Soludo had a 112,000. Now, if you combine the scores of the three other candidates, that's the first runner-up, second runner-up, and third runner-up, their total combined figures are more than that of the winner of the election. So back again, I mean, it's open contestation for power. There's no transference of votes to say that, no, the votes that I got, YPP, I will give you to APC, or PDP, you take my votes, and so on and so forth. That's part of the fractious nature of our elections. There are issues, of course, relating to what can be done beyond the first past the post system that we currently operate. Gentlemen, we'd like to appreciate you on this double take of our conversation today, securing democracy in Africa, as well as your closing thoughts on the Anambra governorship election. Professor Ibrahim Jibrin, Senior Fellow, Center for Democracy and Development, thank you for being our guest this morning. Professor Jide Ofo-Adibe, Professor of International Relations and Political Science, Nasarawa State University. We appreciate you for being our guests on the program this morning. Also, Benasara Kogo Umar, lawyer and international affairs analyst, thanks for being around.
Thank you.
Let's take sports.
It was all sparkling as the Super Eagles held their first training session on Tuesday at the training pitch of the Grand Stade de Taga in Morocco ahead of the 2022 FIFA World Cup qualifiers against Liberia and Cape Verde. Head coach Gordon Ross supervised the session alongside his assistant coaches.
Wonderful conditions in Morocco to train, to prepare, and I hope that tomorrow everybody will be here. Normally tonight will arrive Osimhen, and tomorrow we'll have Igalo and Noble, who replaces Uzoho, who cannot make it. So yeah, we hope that everything will go well without any injuries, and the match will be on Saturday afternoon in a good condition also with this good weather.
The players spent time in the gym on Tuesday morning as they look set to get into proper shape ahead of the games. The Super Eagles will take on the Lone Star of Liberia in matchday 5-day encounter at the Grande Stadia de Taga on Saturday. The three-time African champions will then host the Blue Sharks of Cape Verde in their final group game next week Tuesday at the Teslim Balogun Stadium, Lagos. Meanwhile, Premier League club Watford have announced the signing of Nigerian goalkeeper Maduka Okoye from Dutch outfit Sparta Rotterdam. Okoye penned a 5.5-year deal with the Hornets that will begin on January 1st, 2022. The Nigerian international joins the Hornets for an undisclosed fee from Eredivisie outfit Sparta Rotterdam, to where he will return on loan until the end of 2021-2022 campaign.
All right, let's foray into the foreign scene to see what stories are developing.
The Congolese army has announced that it had recovered all its positions, which were attacked on Sunday night by former rebels of the March 23 movement M23 in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. The military had earlier accused members of the M23 rebellion group of attacking a base in eastern Congo's Rusuru area with the intention of destabilizing the province, and fighting was underway. It was said that the rebels attacked in remote villages of Runyonyi and Shanzu in the strategic hills between Rwanda and Uganda in the North Kivu province and had taken over lands near there in 2012 and were pushed from the area into Uganda and Rwanda by Congolese and United Nations forces in 2013. In an earlier statement, the M23 group, however, denied that they are behind attacks or fighting with the military or government. Now to Europe, the European Commission has accused the Belarusian government of tricking migrants and refugees with false promises of easy access to European Union in what it called a gangster-style approach to a long-running migrant crisis. Hundreds of migrants and refugees remained camped out in near-freezing temperatures in Belarus after Polish security forces blocked people from attempting to cross the border. Poland has for months accused Belarus of trying to cause a major confrontation by encouraging migrants and refugees from the Middle East and Africa to cross into Central Europe and the wider European Union in revenge for Western sanctions on longtime President Alexander Lukashenko's government.
All right, and that's Good Morning Nigeria for today. Today's midweek session. I would like to ask you to join us same time tomorrow for another interesting edition. I am Claire Delabu Abdul Razak. Always remember to join us in the fight against rape and breakfast. Bye-bye.
And I'm Kingsley Osadolo. Take care of yourselves.